Good morning, everybody. It is a blessing to be able to be in the service of the King and here with his people in service to you too. I'm hopeful and thankful for this day that we have together today. I hope you are also. Let's turn our Bibles over to Matthew chapter 13 and put a marker there because you know how I do sometimes and end up taking us in other directions. But our goal is to stay here today, and what we're going to be discussing is one of the first of Jesus' parables. And here in Matthew 13, Jesus is having a rare, quiet moment, and he's sitting on the beach. And who knows exactly what he was thinking about, but for those of us who have gotten to sit at the beach by the lake, it's an opportunity to just rest and breathe in deep and enjoy God's creation. Even not at the lake, getting to come outside and to see the mountain behind, either at sunset or sunrise, doesn't matter. It is a wonderful opportunity to be able to see that and to just have a quiet moment. And Jesus, as we know, even as we were discussing in our class this morning in Colossians, we saw that all things were created through him and for him. They're all held together by his word. And I wonder what it would have been like to be the Creator himself sitting on the beach in his creation in a quiet moment. Unfortunately, for Jesus especially, quiet moments were few and far between. And so here in verse 1 of chapter 13, a crowd begins to gather. And he gets up into what's probably one of the coolest pulpits ever. He gets a boat, commandeers a boat, and pushes out from the shore a little ways and begins to preach his lesson, which consists entirely, in this case, of stories. And stories are interesting. You've all heard, and we talk from time to time in sermons even about stories that maybe you've had or that I've had that are useful in teaching us some lesson about the way the world works as God had designed it. But Jesus' stories are a particular caliber above. And whether it's atheists or Christian scholars alike, everyone comes to the parables and is astounded by them. I have several commentators written by atheists who speak in very glowing remarks about how well done the parables are. Parables are stories, but like other stories or fables or allegories, there's more to the story than just what it seems on its face. Stories like in Aesop's fables, the tortoise and the hare, teach us more than just about some kind of absurd race between these two critters. They're telling us about human nature, about laziness, about hubris, and we're supposed to take a lesson from those. In cases with things like the parables, the sheep are not sheep. The coin is more than just about a coin. In other stories, like my kids and I right now are working through the Lord of the Rings movies, the cursed ring is more than just about a strange object which seems to speak or whisper to people. These stories, good stories, can have a cryptic element to them, but they're trying to teach us something about the way that God made the world and the part that you and I have to play in it. And that would explain in part why Jesus does teach in parables most often. In fact, we're going to come to a passage later which will talk about how regularly Jesus used these parables. These purposes and others we're going to discover in this text so that we can see that it's more than just good stories. It's lessons for us. And so today what we're going to do is two things in this sermon. We're going to talk first about the rules for reading parables, how every parable should be read, so that whether it's Matthew 13 or 21 or any other place that you'll see allegory used in Scripture, you can read those and find the use as God had intended. And the second thing we're going to do is see those rules come to play in the first and probably most well-known of the parables, the parable of the sower. The title for this lesson is going to be Dirty People, because that's what this parable is all about. It's not about soils and seeds and a sower. It's about you and I, and it's about God. So let's go ahead, and if you're not there already, please turn to Matthew 13, and let's start our passage in verse 10 as we get ready to read this. And as we discussed, there are several rules that you need to use when reading a parable. Just like when you're watching a movie, I remember taking a cinema class, which was a whole lot of fun. It didn't help me with any degrees or anything like that. But it was fun because the teacher was telling us, here's how you watch movies. There's a way to watch them. One of the rules that she gave us was you have to bring in she called it a suspension of disbelief. You're going to see crazy stuff in stories and movies. You're going to see aliens, you're going to see spaceships, and you're going to see all sorts of stuff that isn't real. But usually people that are making movies and writing stories are trying to tell you something through that. So suspend the disbelief. Yes, we all know there's no such thing as, light speed travel. But listen to the story behind the movie. And that's one of the things that I thought was pretty cool about that. The same thing is true for when you're reading the parables. Although, while you're not going to see spaceships and aliens and so forth, what you are going to see are very real, day-to-day type of stories that anybody at the time could absolutely have related to. And what that does is it introduces a topic to you in a very comfortable sort of setting. Some of us were talking about this a little earlier today, is that you can have messages which are the fire and brimstone, and you'll see plenty of those in Scripture, especially in the Old Testament prophets. But you'll often see other ways that this message gets across, and sometimes through that very comfortable, very inviting setting of come and listen to a story. You've all heard it before, a shepherd and his sheep. And we go, oh yeah, I know, my cousin's a shepherd, and so forth. Like we know what that looked like. And so each parable has several things that are important to understand when you're reading them. The first is that each parable is internally cohesive. It makes its own sense in its own story. And it makes a lot of sense, again, from a day-to-day standpoint. This means that you can't always compare parable to parable, and you've got to be careful if you're going to try. Sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's not. Sometimes goats are good things, sometimes they're not. Sometimes leaven is a good thing in the parable. That is rye or yeast for a dough. Sometimes it's a bad thing. It just depends, and you've got to take each parable as it comes. The other thing you'll find about each parable is that, again, it's relatable on a surface level, but that's not the point. That you know that there's a shepherd and that he cares about his sheep, that's not the main thing. We're trying to see that it is symbolic. And so here's the next thing, is that each parable has a central hidden meaning. It's hidden through symbolism. It's not hidden in esoteric mysticism. It's hidden in plain sight, as we would say. If you want to get the parable, you can. It is accessible and it is easy to reach. But if you don't want to understand the parable, if you don't like the message and maybe you feel like it says something negative about you, you don't have to, and you won't. It'll go right over your head. I remember as a kid, I'd be finally invited up to the adults' table for dinner and things like that, when we were all there together for Thanksgiving. And they'd be telling jokes, and I'd be listening intently, trying to figure out what's going on. And they might say something and kind of direct it to me, and I wouldn't get it. And then I remember parents or, relatives or whoever going, and I'm going, what does that mean? What does that mean? There is a possibility that a parable could go right over our heads if we don't want to hear what's going on. And so the symbolism there is fairly light, but each parable has certain stated elements within it that are the only things that matter for that story. It doesn't help us to read through and when we see a parable about a shepherd and his sheep, we're not going to ask things like, well, how many sheep are there? And what's this sheep doing and that sheep doing? That's not the point, except for that one time where you have the parable of the 99 and the one. And the point isn't that there are 99, there could be 199, it doesn't matter. There are things that are unstated in the parable that are not the point of the attention. So look at what is mentioned and focus on that. Those are the things that matter for the story. And so again, lastly, like we'd mentioned before, for first-timers especially, parables can be kind of tricky. If you've been versed in this for a while, maybe if you haven't been raised in the pew, as we would say, sometimes parables are tough. But here's something else that I'd like us to maybe do if we get a chance. Is for those of you who've maybe been Christians for decades, maybe you've heard the parable of the sower countless times, as much as you could, and I know this really is an impossible task to ask of you, but as much as you could, pretend like you're about to hear it now for the first time. And that's a hard thing because for those of you who've been Christians for forever and ever, maybe you've heard this since you were a very little kid. But I like to read through this for my own personal benefit. I like to read through the parables and imagine like I am hearing it for the first time. And to try and challenge myself to see, would I get it? If I was there and watching Jesus tell this story from his pulpit in the boat, and telling all about a sower going to throw seed into soil and all these strange different types of soil, would I get what he's trying to tell me? And I'll confess that there are times in these parables where I would not get the answer that he said right off the bat. There's a lot of reasons for that. There are some parables here that we're going to see later on eventually as we get time to get to them here and there. Some parables that are given with an explanation. And there are other parables that have no explanation. And those are great tests to go and read and see, do I think about these things the way that Jesus is intending? So we're going to read here in Matthew 13 and verses 10 through 17 to show you that if you're going to read through this, and let's assume, I don't know exactly, everybody's never asked everybody in the room about how many times you've read the parable of the sower, but if you've not seen this yet, this section that we're about to read is a private conversation with his disciples after the public telling of the story. And you have to remember as we read this that not everybody in the audience got the explanation. They were not told the explanation. They just got the story and Jesus moved on. So here the disciples struggled too. In their first time hearing this, the 12 heard this parable of the sower for the first time and they were confused. So I would say don't feel bad if you've never heard this before and you don't get quite the answer. But also recognize that Jesus is inviting people to understand the answer. And if you want to, you can. It says here in verse 10 that the disciples came and said to him, "Why did you speak to them in parables?" Jesus answered them, "To you," that is to the 12, "it has been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been granted. For whoever has, to him more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. But whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. Therefore I speak to them in parables, because while seeing they do not see, and while hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. In their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is being fulfilled, which says, 'You will keep on hearing, but will not understand. You will keep on seeing, but will not perceive. For the hearts of this people has become dull. With their ears they scarcely hear, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise they would see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, understand with their heart, and return, and I would heal them.' But blessed are your eyes," he says to the 12, "because they see, and your ears because they hear. For truly I say to you that many prophets and righteous men desired to see what you see and did not see it, and to hear what you hear and did not hear it." Remember once more, this conversation we just read is just with the 12. This is in a private setting away from the crowds, and they're asking, "Why did you tell stories this way?" And it will also become apparent, too, that they're not quite getting the stories as Jesus had intended them. Do you remember, for those of you, in that time period, it's been a while now, but I do remember, too, even shorter in years, is Paul Harvey's The Rest of the Story. You remember hearing that on the radio? I loved hearing that as a kid. It always came on when Mom and I and my sister also were running errands in town, trying to kind of eat up time until we could meet for Bible study on Wednesday nights. And I remember we'd pull over, and oftentimes we'd have lunch in the car, and we would listen to the rest of the story. And if you're not familiar with that, what it was Paul Harvey, with his amazing voice, would tell you a kind of cryptic, real-life story about real people doing real things, but he would leave all the identifying features out until the very end of him telling this. And as you're hearing it about what this person would do, this mystery person, you'd be amazed at what sort of things would accomplish, and you'd be trying to figure it out. It's a mystery. Who is this person? Do I know who this is? And by the end of the stories, it all played out, he'd tell you, and that's what, Colonel Sanders did before he started KFC, which, by the way, is a crazy story. But also, and then as he'd finish it up, he'd say, "And now you have the rest of the story." Imagine if you listened to Paul Harvey without that last line, and you were expected to figure out who and what all that was about. That'd be a trick. If you haven't listened to Paul Harvey, I'd recommend Mike Rowe's podcast, That's the Way I Heard It, where he's trying to kind of carry on as a spiritual succession. And you can go get those. He does the same exact thing. And the same idea is, if you listen to the first part of the story without the identifying features, would you understand the story? Would you know the person? Would you recognize that great individual that was selected for the story? And that's so much of what's happening in the parables here. And as such, it is very easy to get it wrong. And it creates an interesting problem where there is every opportunity to abuse a parable, if you want to. There's plenty of things in Scripture that God said are good and can very easily be abused, if you want to. But these were given specifically for a few different reasons. And one, as Jesus had mentioned by quoting Isaiah, was to get around people's defenses. Later on in some other parables that Jesus will tell, he'll talk about blind people and how obviously they're not seeing and so forth. And the Pharisees that were listening to him at the time, the text tells us, recognized that he was talking about them. Ooh, and they get all uppity and they say, "Are you calling us blind?" And Jesus is kind of like, "Well, that's your interpretation." It was the right interpretation. But they heard it and they wanted to throw it away immediately. But what parables do is they give us our best chance to bypass any defense you and I might have, where we might feel tempted to argue with Jesus, until that story settles in us and it kind of grows and develops, and then we wake up to it, and then we get a choice. And we can ignore it again or abuse it or whatever the case might be, but it's designed to sink in, and then the rest is up to the hearer. There are other teachings where Jesus is much more direct, but regularly, and if you turn over to verses 34 and 35 in this chapter, Jesus talked with the average common person, with you and I, if we happened to see him as he was coming through town, talked to the average person only in parables. Look at verse 34. "All these things Jesus spoke to the crowd in parables, and he did not speak to them without a parable. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet, 'I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things hidden since the foundation of the world,'" as he quotes from the psalmist. So there's the rules for the parables, some things to help us as we get ready to read this. And next, as we've been discussing here and there, is that parables have a purpose. In these parables, you are going to learn about the kingdom of heaven. Almost every parable begins this way, especially in Matthew's gospel. Jesus will start, "The kingdom of heaven is like." And don't ignore that. That makes all the difference when you're trying to figure it out. And that was something that the crowd would have heard. This is about the kingdom of heaven. And so as you interpret this, you are going to learn lessons about Christ's kingdom and how much of a pleasure it is indeed, as we'd mentioned before, to serve the great king. Something else you'll notice about the parables as far as their purpose goes is that you will get more insight into them. Each time you read them, you'll see extra things, not that are new or that you're bringing into the text, hopefully, but that were always there, always baked in. And you'll get more and more if you want to think like God does. Let's go back up to the passage we read, verses 10 through 17 once more. And let's go down to verse 12. He says, "For whoever has, to him more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. But whoever does not have, even what he has shall be taken away from him." Everybody's got some level of insight. There's people that are, as my dad would say, more book learned. And then there's other people that are street smart. And each one of them have some special thing that they are able to use to interpret the world around them. Everybody's got insight into reading people in some degree, or reading a circumstance, or whatever the case is. And when you come to hear Jesus' story, everybody's going to be able to get something from it. But if you want to think like God does, you'll be able to get the intended purpose behind it. You will be granted even more insight if you want to learn what the lesson God left there. You'll also get answers to long sought after questions. And this should not make us feel like we are the ones that hold the secret knowledge, but that you're being invited into what was, an open story, something that everybody could be a part of. And so you'll share in that with other people who, as Jesus mentioned in times past, were longing to hear news about the kingdom of heaven, and it was not their time yet. You will get to understand those things by reading this story, by hearing it. Things like Peter would say in his letters in 1 Peter chapter 1, the prophets longed to understand the Christ, even though they didn't know who he was or when he would appear or what he would be like. You get to know that if you want to interpret the parable as God intended. So you'll have answers to long, thousands and thousands of years worth of questions. And again, as we'd mentioned before, those who don't want that won't get it. You won't get it. And that's your option. But that's not the parable's fault, and it's not Jesus' fault. It's up to us, whether or not you want to hear the message of the parable. And so, like we mentioned before, let's go ahead and look at the parable of the sower and try and see what message Jesus has here for the first and most well-known of the parables. Again, one more time, I know it's impossible. You can't erase memories that especially are front of mind. But if you could try to hear this for the first time and see what Jesus has to say in the way that he said it. Matthew chapter 13, verses 1 through 9. That day Jesus went out of the house and was sitting by the sea, and large crowds gathered to him. So he got into a boat and sat down, and the whole crowd was standing on the beach. He spoke many things to them in parables, saying, Behold, the sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell by the road. The birds came and ate them up. Others fell on the rocky places where they did not have much soil. And immediately they sprang up because they had no depth of soil. But when the sun had risen, they were scorched. And because they had no root, they withered away. Others fell among the thorns, and the thorns came up and choked them out. And others fell on the good soil and yielded a crop, some 100, some 60, some 30. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. And that's the end of the story. There's no interpretation given. And as the text goes on, I think we can kind of conclude that he went right into another story and right into another story and told several all through chapter 13. And even at chapter 21, you'll see more of Jesus' stories, his parables. But that's all they got to hear. If you got ears to hear, let them hear. That is to say, the meaning is right there if you want it. But what is it? Now, as we read in verses 10 through 17 earlier, the disciples are terribly confused. And again, there's a lot of reasons for that. There were some people, I imagine, in that audience that understood immediately and exactly what Jesus is saying. And so much of this depends on how well you knew the Old Testament. As Jews, you should have known that. You should have understood those things from your childhood, as you would have been raised in synagogue, as your parents would have been telling you about these things. You should have had every opportunity to get it. But for us, especially as maybe Gentiles, this might be a little bit harder. The disciples, as a good cross-section of society, you've got people in the disciples who are educated, who are uneducated, who are blue-collar or white-collar, as we might call them today. You got everybody. You got some of everybody there. And they're having a hard time. So what does this mean? Well, first, let's bring out the elements, as you should always do in every parable. What has been told to me here in this story? Well, first, there is a sower. And this is in some ways different than like a planter, someone who's going to actually go and stick a seed down in the soil and be very careful and curated about all this. A sower is going through their field and it's just tossing seed everywhere that they can for some large crop. Jesus will talk in other parables about sowers and how it seems to be this kind of widespread thing. And for us, I've not gone out and sown a field like this. Maybe you have. But it helps us to learn a little bit about what the time was like and what everyone at that time would have understood. Also, you see specifically selected out is the seed. And the seed is doing something in the ground. It's producing some sort of effect through its relationship with the ground. And the ground is also mentioned in 4 different types. This soil. And the first, we can use soil very loosely. It's the roadside. And especially as you're driving down, this section of 15, as you're heading down towards maybe Canaryville and St. George, all the construction that's going on there, the roadside is just full of gravel and asphalt and, at a time like this, cobblestones and packed down earth from miles and miles and thousands of people walking on this. You get the idea of roadside soil. That's fairly straightforward. There's also rocky soil. I had some pictures I was going to put up here and totally forgot. I found a picture somewhere near Cedar Breaks of a tree that's just growing right out of the middle of a boulder. And you've all seen that or seen pictures of that. And it's amazing to see that. And sometimes we go, wow, what this rare thing. It's rare for a reason. Because if you and I were going to go up there and just grab that juniper, you could pull it down probably with one arm. It's got nothing to it in the rock. There's no porous substance for it to get anything from. It really is kind of a freak accident of nature that there happened to be just enough soil there, probably left by some bird or the wind or something, to be able to let that tree grow. It's not how it works usually. And those trees are often very unhealthy, despite them being amazing in their own picture and image of them. But lastly here, second to last, we've got the thorny soil, which seems like it's doing well. And you might have had plants that you've planted, and then weeds came up, and you've got to keep on the weeds, or else they'll dominate what's going on there. That's the way that God designed weeds and thorns, is that they grow quickly, and they take advantage of their situation very fast. And lastly, you've got the good soil, this arable soil, It's receptive, it's useful, it's light and fluffy. I think about the soil around here, and we went to the nursery last year across the valley. And we were just asking questions, tell us about how things grow and what the zone looks like and everything. And they were saying, one person said, if I was going to give our soil a letter grade, it would be a C+. And they were like, you got to do a lot of work. And he said, there's a joke around here about if you're going to buy I can't remember how he said it, you're going to buy a $20 tree and dig a $50 hole, is what he said, because you got to put all sorts of amendments in there to make the clay, which is solid, even if it is nutritious, to break up enough so that you can get anything to do its work. And so we got some trees, and oh yeah, it was quite a bit of work to get the pick out and dig up all that clay. Good soil can be moved with your hand. You can step into it. After we dug those holes and filled them in with their amendments and so forth, you could about fall in with how much softness was there with all of its nutrients as well. And that's good soil. It's soft, it's receptive, it's willing to be moved. And so as Jesus is asked by his disciples what all this means, he graciously gives them an answer. Again, once more, remember, this was in private, a private conversation, and not everybody got to hear it. But thankfully also you and I get to read it now, a private conversation with them. And even still, there are a few parables here in this chapter and in other places where nobody still has given us an interpretation. An excellent opportunity to see if you want to see the message God has planted here. So let's go ahead and see what Jesus says. In verse 18, he gives the description to them. And think about this, compare this to your own mental notes that you may have just been taking. Hear then the parable of the sower. And I love the way he introduces it this second time. Hear the message. Here it is. The sower, in this case, is the Son of Man. And we know this, and we should be careful, because another parable later in this passage does mention a sower and does say in verse 37 that the one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. And in that parable, later on, the wheat and the tares, there's good seed and there's bad seed. Here in this passage, the seed is good too. It's doing something. The end of the story is that it produces a crop. That's a good seed. And so here I think we can safely say that the one who sows the seed is the Son of Man. It's Jesus himself. And what that means then is that the seed is the word of the kingdom. Look at the first part of verse 19. This is Matthew 13, verse 19. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, he goes on to talk about the first soil. And so the seed that's being planted here is the message of the king and of his dominion over all things. The soil, in a nutshell, in a general sense, is people. And you can see this from verse 38, again in his other parable. The field is the world, he says. And as he goes into that place, that's where the parable distinguishes itself, because in that one, the good seed now is sons of the kingdom. But here in this first parable, it will become very obvious, if it isn't already, that we're talking about people. And that's why we titled the lesson the way that we did. The soil is people. It's hearts and minds, if you will. It's the potential to be receptive to the message. And it makes sense why this parable is the first that we have in the text, because it's going to help drive all the rest of the message as it goes along. And so this soil is people, and the first of the soils that gets selected is the roadside soil. It's people who don't understand. Look at the end of verse 19. It says here that when the word of the kingdom comes and a person does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is the one on whom seed was sown beside the road. Does this mean that an otherwise willing person was duped against their will into something that they could not hear because somebody intercepted the message before they got? I would have changed my mind. I would have been receptive to the kingdom. I would have produced a crop, well, except for... But that sounds very much like how Adam and Eve spoke in the garden. Why didn't you do the right thing? Why didn't you understand what I told you? Well, other people, other things, circumstances, whatever the case is. This is not the case where they were intercepted against their will and would have changed their mind. Scripture is very consistent that for the evil one to have any opportunity to come and snatch away anything, as the text would show, is because we would let him in. In places like Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 27, Paul says, do not give the devil an opportunity. That's the quote. In places like James 4 and verse 7, submit therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. What's the implication there? Somebody did not resist him. Somebody invited him in. There's also 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verses 1 through 2, which say that the Spirit explicitly says that in latter times some will fall away from the faith, paying attention to deceitful spirits and doctrines of demons, by means of the hypocrisy of liars seared in their own conscience as with a branding iron. And that's a gruesome sort of image. You've probably heard the phrase before, don't catch a falling knife. I remember my mom telling me, she was a quilter, don't catch a falling iron. Don't even try for it because you will get burned. It's a gruesome image there that people have seared their own selves with a hot iron so that they'll ignore things. If there's some of you who have, maybe the unfortunate situation where you've got scar tissue somewhere on your body, that loses feeling, it loses potential, it loses elasticity. And people have done that on purpose. How? The text tells us in 1 Timothy, because they listened to, they paid attention to false doctrines. They paid attention to liars and then became liars themselves, liars to themselves. The roadside soil in verse 19 is not somebody who, oh no, unfortunate circumstance, Satan intercepted the pass. This person created a situation that lent itself to Satan doing what Satan has always done. He is a liar and the father of lies. The next soil is also people. It's ways of thinking, and it's this rocky soil. And here in the passage in verse 20, it shows us that this rocky soil, the seed that grows in it, has no root or substance. Look at verse 20. The one on whom the seed was sown in the rocky places, this is the man who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. I've had the privilege to be involved in countless lives of people who had recently converted to Christ. And there is an excitement there that is contagious and it's encouraging and it's so much fun to be around. But then, if that person doesn't get more instruction, if that person doesn't get more substance, there's a word that we sometimes will attach to this. It's the idea of discipleship. That is to say that when a person has become a disciple of Christ, has been baptized and washed, and they're fresh, they're brand new, they were born yesterday, as it were, and they're going out into the world, which is indeed a dangerous place spiritually. And if they've not been brought up with that and given some undergirding and foundation and a hand to hold as they go out into the world and to kind of check them on things and bring them back to Scripture and show them how God has designed stuff, that person is primed and ready to be devoured. Just like we wouldn't send a little child out into the night on the street or out into some place in the wild when we're camping. Hey kid, you're 4 years old or whatever, go and collect firewood for me out here where the coyotes are. You would not do that to somebody who is brand new. They need some help. That's a lesson in part for all of us to help one another, but it's just as much a lesson for the new Christian. That if you are a new Christian, you are brand new. There's a lot to learn. It's all here and ready if you want it. If you want it. But if you are going to just ride the high of that new life in Christ for a couple of weeks and just let that be all that it is, you will find that lack of substance and root and knowledge in spiritual things as God's delivered them through the Scriptures is going to make your life a real hard time. And most Christians do not live in Christ after that. The passage again tells us in verse 20, they immediately receive it with joy, yet he has no firm root in himself, verse 21, but is only temporary, a fair weather disciple, if you will. And when affliction or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he falls away. It was the word that showed him salvation. But at some point that person's going to go, it's the word that's causing all these problems in my life. And something's going to give. The rocky soil starts well. It does not finish well. The next one is the thorny soil. And this is a person whose mind has been completely wrapped up in worries and distractions. Earlier on in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus talks a lot about worry and how dangerous it is. And he puts it in connection to service to another master who is not God. And so here in the passage in verse 22, it says, the one on whom the seed was sown among the thorns, This is the man who hears the word, and the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. That person may have been a Christian for decades. And then, the bird dropped a thorny seed there, and it sprouted up, and it took them. It choked them out, it says. I think about all the things that we might have reason to worry about. Man, the last week in the news has been crazy. And the week before that, and the week before that. All the way back to Jesus' time and before. Think about the Israelites during the anticipation of Babylon coming in and subjugating them. There's been bad news for forever. I saw a social media post here this last week where somebody had invited, this young man invited a young woman out to a date. And she said no. There may be other reasons for this, who knows. But the reason that she gave in the text was, with all the things that are going on in the world right now, I don't know if I can devote that much attention to, this other relationship. There's stuff going on in the world all the time. It may have been, she just didn't like him or whatever the case is. But you can't say things like, there's bad stuff going on, and so I won't do what's right. You've seen all the news about the decline in population, the population collapse, and how nobody's having kids anymore. And that can be apparent in other places in the country, especially where we come from. We saw that a lot. And do you remember, or maybe you have heard, or maybe you've said before in the past, things that all of our peers were saying at the time is, man, that's cool that you got kids and all. I couldn't have kids and bring them into a world like this. Have you heard that before? The command in Genesis to Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply, is repeated with Noah, is repeated later on, it's repeated into the New Testament. It's an expectation for us. Bringing people into the world that might come to have a relationship with Christ. But a lot of people say, you know what, I don't want to do that. Because look at all this other nasty stuff that's going on in the world. Well, yeah, it's always that way. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's been worse in times past. Now think about that, not just when it comes to family or dating, but when it comes to our eternal soul. I have unfortunately had many conversations that took that exact thing. What's keeping you from becoming a Christian? There's a lot going on in my life right now. There's a lot going on in the world right now. I just can't devote that much time to it. It's up to you, the hearer. The thorny soil is worried. The thorny soil has distractions. And if it isn't worries of the world, the text says, it's deceitfulness of riches. Please turn over to Psalm 52. Psalm 52. We're going to read the whole psalm here. And the imagery behind this is very, from maybe a modern context, kind of in your face towards the end. But it does tell you something about what worries for possessions or safety can do to a person. And what not caring about that, or maybe we could put it more accurately, not being concerned with that or motivated by that, can do for you too. In Psalm 52, starting off, it says, for the choir director, a Maxil of David, when Dog the Edomite came and told Saul and said to him, David has come to the house of Ahimelech. Here's the psalm. Why do you boast in evil, O mighty man? The loving kindness of God endures all day long. Your tongue devises destruction like a sharp razor, O worker of deceit. You love evil more than good, falsehood more than speaking what is right, Selah. You love all words that devour, O deceitful tongue. But God will break you down forever. He will snatch you up and tear you away from your tent and uproot you from the land of the living, Selah. The righteous will see and fear, and will laugh at him, saying, behold, the man who would not make God his refuge, but trusted in the abundance of his riches and was strong in his evil desire. But as for me, I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the loving kindness of God forever and ever. I will give you thanks forever because you have done it, and I will wait on your name, for it is good in the presence of your godly ones. There's people who don't want to be here. But for those of you who have chosen to be here, you are a tree sprouting up in a fertile place in a tender garden that God has prepared for himself among all his people. And it is a blessing to be there. The deceitfulness of riches and trusting in those things ends for everybody. Everybody dies, and you, as they say, can't take it with you. But you will take something else with you, a weight that will keep you from being with God if you'll let it. So pick what things you want to associate with. Pick what things you want to worry about. Pick what things you are concerned with. You'll notice also in the psalm it says that the righteous ones see this and they fear. Fear what? They don't fear riches. They don't fear the evil man. They don't fear the circumstance. They fear God. And they serve him with their whole being, which brings us to the last soil, the good soil. I think describing soil as receptive is helpful in this way, as movable is helpful in this way. We told you about those tree pits that we had dug and trying to keep it, cordoned off and everything. And I remember seeing evidence that deer had come into the yard. And one of those was, from droppings and so forth. But others was from footprints, because when they stepped into the tree pit to eat off my tree, there's a big old deep footprint from this deer hoof because it was soft soil. And I was like, It wasn't also that they just took off the branches, but they potentially caused an issue for roots in the future. And so we did things to try and help with that. But that's the idea of good soil, is that it is receptive. It is willing to listen and to be moved. It is open, and it will receive roots as they start to develop, a seed as it begins. Let's go back to Matthew chapter 13 and verse 23. There is this good soil which produces good fruit. I've been saying recently how I feel like if people would just give me the time of day, they'd be able to see the receptiveness of the Scripture. I don't say that because I think that I'm terribly persuasive. I think the Word is persuasive. And if they'll just open it up and let somebody work with them to try and see connections and see what the whole thing says, it's a lot of book to read in a short amount of time. And so it's helpful to have somebody short track it for you, get you to what the message is trying to say in a reasonable fashion. It's the Scriptures that are persuasive. Look at verse 23. It says, "On the one on whom seed was sown on the good soil, this is the man who hears the word and understands it. And he indeed bears fruit and brings forth some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. That soil is ready to work. It accommodates the message. It moves out of the way as the roots expand. It grows up and provides a healthy environment for the message of the kingdom to do its full work in a person. And not just the one who hears it, but the tree that sprouts from that produces the fruit, that provides a home for worms in the soil, for birds in its branches, for bees as pollinators, for all sorts of animals, even you and I who would come and derive fruit from its branches. It is a blessing to everyone that interacts with it. And that's what this good soil can do, can allow to happen, to make an impact of the kingdom of heaven on earth, to let God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So here's the point of the parable. Here's what we get to at the end. The parable is not about you and I being sowers or playing the role of God. God sent the seed into the world and it's ready to do its work. The point of the parable is to ask a question. Which kind of soil are you? We are all people who have had contact with the Scriptures, with the word of the kingdom. Everyone has that opportunity. What will you do with it? It's like James says in James chapter 1 and verses 21 through 22, "Therefore putting all aside all filthiness, all that remains of wickedness, in humility receive the word implanted, which is able to save your souls. But prove yourselves doers of the word, and not merely hearers who delude themselves." Hearers who, like the thorny soil, think that they're doing well but are being choked out by worry and deceit of riches. Or think that they're doing well because they sprouted up real fast but don't have the endurance to make that race run to the end where it produces something. Or even the disloyal or the deceived soils who give those things up or never give it an opportunity to work in them to begin with. Do not be deceived. Do not be disloyal. Do not be distracted. The only kind of soil spoken of well here is the one that is dedicated to the message of the kingdom, to letting it bear fruit in their life, to doing something with what they've heard. So here's the invitation this morning. Receive the message of the kingdom. Understand it. The opportunity is there. As we've seen Jesus even express and explain this parable, don't let yourself be anything other than good, receptive soil. And if you'd like to respond to the message of the kingdom this morning, if you'd like to become a Christian, if you'd like to let it work in you, you can do so this morning and be baptized. If you'd like to do so, you can now as we stand and sing a song together.